The sign said she was free and nobody wanted her. But all it took was one conversation for Eitan to discover that the orc woman had once been respected throughout the entire region before someone destroyed her name and stole everything she had built. The sign said she was free and nobody wanted her. Ethan Hale read those words twice before his jaw tightened and he looked away. He told himself it was none of his business. He had feed to buy, a broken water trough to replace, and 2 horses that had been limping for reasons nobody on the Hale ranch could explain. He had come to Stoneford with a short list and short a coin. He did not have room for other people's problems. He had learned that the hard way. He had been awake since 4 in the morning. The road from his property to Stoneford ran 12 miles through cracked red earth and dry scrub oak, and he had made the trip alone, as he always did. The saddle leather was warm against his thighs. The sky overhead was pale and enormous. For most of the ride, he had not thought about anything at all, which was how he preferred things. Stoneford's market sprawled across 4 city blocks, louder and more crowded than he remembered from his last visit. 60 years after the Peace of Cathara, the sight of green-skinned orc traders arguing prices beside human farmers no longer surprised anyone. That was what people said anyway. Eitan noticed the way certain men turned their shoulders when an orc family passed. He noticed the small silences that opened up in a crowd whenever someone who wasn't human tried to negotiate at a prime stall. Nobody said anything. Nobody ever said anything anymore. That was the difference 60 years made. He passed a blacksmith's, a grain merchant, a woman selling dried herbs from a blue cart. He bought rope. He examined a water fitting that cost twice what he expected and walked away from it. He ate half a piece of cornbread he had brought from home. Ordinary things, the kind of morning he had built his life around. Then he turned into the smaller lane that cut behind the livestock pens. And he stopped. At the far end of the lane, where the crowd thinned to almost nothing, a wooden post rose from the dry earth. Around the post, a length of heavy chain had been wrapped twice and locked. At the end of that chain sat a woman. He registered her orc heritage immediately. The emerald tint of her skin, dusty now and streaked with grime. The slight point of her ears visible through tangled black hair that fell past her waist in clumps. She sat with her knees drawn up and her back against the post, and her eyes focused somewhere low on the ground in front of her. The particular focus of someone who has learned not to see anything that will only hurt them. She was very thin. Her clothes were old. Her wrists, where the chain connected, showed the darkened marks of long wear. A piece of rough board hung from the chain by a short piece of wire. Someone had painted 4 words on it in black. Free. Nobody wants her. Eitan stood in the dust of that lane for a long moment. He had things to do. He reminded himself clearly of each one. The grain merchant, the water fitting, the long ride home before dark. He was 45 years old and had spent 20 of those years learning that he could not fix everything, and that trying to fix everything was what had cost him the most important things he had ever had. He turned and walked back the way he had come. He made it 11 steps. He stopped because of her eyes. He had not looked directly at them while he stood near her. But some part of him had registered them anyway, the way you register something very quiet in a room that is otherwise loud. She had not been looking at him. She had not been looking at the people passing at the far end of the lane. She had not been looking at anything. She had already left. That was what her face said. Whatever had happened to this woman, it had taken so long and cost so much that some essential part of her had simply gone somewhere else and left the body behind to manage on its own. Eitan had seen that look once before. He saw it every morning in his mirror for 2 years after his wife Clara died. He turned back. He kept his distance. He had learned early in life that approaching a frightened animal too fast was a good way to get kicked, and that the same was generally true of frightened people. So he stopped about 6 feet from her and did not move, and waited to see what she would do. She did nothing for a long time. She was so still she might have been carved. Then, without any movement of her head, her eyes shifted to his boots. He let her look. He did not speak. He stood in the thin morning shade of a building that smelled of old hay, and let her decide what kind of threat he was. She seemed to conclude that he was some kind of threat, because after several seconds her arms rose and crossed in front of her face. The motion was too fast and too smooth to be deliberate. It was the movement of a body that had practiced protecting itself. A muscle memory built over years of someone else's hands. Something in Aitan's chest made a sound like a door closing quietly in an empty house. He did not move toward her. He did not speak. He simply waited until her arms lowered a fraction, not all the way, but enough to show that she was still watching. And then he unhooked the canteen from his belt and crouched down and set it on the ground between them. He did not offer it to her. He did not explain it. He put it down and leaned back on his heels and looked at the wall of the building behind her, giving her the gift of not being watched. He heard the chain shift. He heard her breathing change. The small, careful sound of someone trying to move without being noticed, then the scrape of the canteen on the grit, then nothing for a moment, then drinking, slow at first, then the desperate, continuous swallowing of someone crossing a longer distance than anyone should have to cross without water. When it stopped, he waited again. He had a lot of practice waiting. 20 years ago, he had come home from the northern border with two things: his horse and a wound in his left shoulder that had healed wrong and still ached on cold mornings. He had told Clara very little about what he had seen up there. She had told him that silence was fine, that it would pass, and that there was always something to do on the farm when the nights got too loud. She had been right about that. She had been right about most things. She had been gone for 6 years now. He had kept the farm running, he had kept the horses, he had made it to every dawn and done everything that needed doing. But there was a weight to it now that there hadn't been before, a low and permanent heaviness that he had simply decided was the price of continuing. He reached into the tool pouch on his belt. The chain at the post rattled sharply. He heard her breath catch. He pulled out a short bolt cutter, the kind used for fence locks, and held it up so she could see it before he did anything else. "Chain," he said. That was the only word he said. She watched him. Her arms were up again. Her entire body was coiled with that particular tension he recognized from horses that had been badly handled. Not aggression exactly, but the absolute readiness to suffer. He moved slowly. He knelt beside the post where the chain attached and worked the bolt cutter into the weakest link. The metal was older than it looked. It took 3 attempts, then it fell. The chain hit the ground in a short, heavy sound, and a cloud of red dust rose and settled, and the woman who had been attached to the post was no longer attached to anything. She stared at her own wrists. She turned them over, once, then again, like she was checking whether they still worked the same way, like she expected someone to come and reattach everything. "You can go," Eitan said, "wherever you want. Nobody's holding you here." She did not move. He stood and brushed off his knees and picked up the canteen from the ground. He waited a reasonable amount of time. She still had not moved. Then she spoke. Her voice was low and rough from something, disuse or dryness, or something older and less curable than both. It cracked at the edge of the words, like the voice of someone who had stopped expecting to be heard. She said, "Go where?" Eitan had no answer for that. He looked at her for a moment. Then he said he would be in the market for another hour, and she could do whatever she chose. And he walked back toward the grain merchant's stall with the bolt cutter in his hand, and her question moving through him, like a stone dropped into still water, sending rings out to the edges of everything. He bought the grain. He looked at the water fitting again, and this time bought it, even though the price was wrong. Because the trough needed fixing, and there was no one else on the farm to fix it. He found a used saddle blanket in better condition than he expected and added it to the pile on the back of his horse. He did everything on the list. He was aware the entire time of a presence at some distance behind him. Not close, not obvious, just a shadow that moved when he moved and stopped when he stopped. maintaining the careful interval of someone accustomed to being told to disappear on short notice. He did not turn around. He stopped at a feed merchant's stall near the center of the market, where a broad man with a red face was offering a bay stallion for a price that would have been remarkable if the horse had been worth half what the man was claiming. Eitan had bought and sold enough animals to know the difference between a salesman's patter and the truth, but the price was still attracting a small crowd, and he found himself drifting toward it to see what all the attention was for. The horse was beautiful on the surface. Deep chest, powerful hindquarters, the kind of bone structure that told a story. The merchant was telling his own story with great enthusiasm, a bloodline that went back to a famous orc racing stable from the western provinces, he said. Stud fees alone would recoup the purchase price in 2 seasons. Eitan was reaching for the horse's near foreleg to check the joint when a voice spoke quietly from just behind his right shoulder. "Don't." He glanced back. She was standing 3 feet behind him, still dusty, still marked by the chain on her wrists, still carrying the look of someone who expected punishment for taking up space. But her eyes, when she looked at the horse, were different from anything he had seen in them before. They were sharp and focused and entirely certain. "His left testicle is atrophied," she said. Her voice was still rough but steadier than before. "You can see the imbalance in the way he stands if you look at his pelvis. He hasn't sired a foal in 2 years. Whoever sold him to this man knew and didn't say." She said it quietly. Not to the crowd, to him. The merchant turned immediately, volume rising, demanding to know who was speaking and on what authority. Several people in the crowd looked at her the way people in Stoneford looked at an orc woman who spoke without being invited to. Not with hatred exactly, but with the specific irritation of people whose assumptions have been inconvenienced. Eitan looked at the horse again. He looked at the pelvic angle. He looked at the way the stallion shifted its weight. He was not an expert, but he could see now that someone had told him where to look. He stepped back from the stall. The merchant followed him with noise and grievance. Eitan walked away. The noise stopped. These things had a way of resolving themselves when there was no audience left to perform for. He stopped in the middle of the lane and turned around. She was still 3 feet behind him. Her eyes had gone careful again now that the horses were no longer in front of her. She looked like she was waiting to be told that she had overstepped. "Thank you," he said. She seemed briefly uncertain how to respond to that. "Your name," he said. Not a demand. Just a question, offered the same way he'd offered the canteen, set on the ground between them, hers to pick up or leave. She was quiet for long enough that he thought she wasn't going to answer. Then she said, "Dunya." She said it the way people say a word they haven't used in a while and aren't sure still fits them. Carefully, like testing weight on an injured leg. He nodded. "Eitan Hale," he said. "I have a farm about 12 miles east. I have horses that are giving me trouble I can't explain." He adjusted the strap on his saddlebag. "I'm not offering you charity. I'm offering you a problem I need solved. If you want to come and look, you're welcome." He turned and walked toward his horse. Behind him, after a moment, he heard her follow. The road to the Hale Ranch ran east through country that seemed to forget it had ever been anything but dry. Scrub oak, red dust, occasional fences running crooked across low hills, the kind of landscape that didn't ask anything of you and didn't offer anything either. Dunya sat on the spare horse Eitan had brought for hauling supplies, now carrying her instead, and she did not speak for the first 2 hours. He did not push. He had learned that silence on a long road was not always emptiness. Sometimes it was the only honest thing 2 people could offer each other. He was aware of her watching the land, the way she tracked the light on the hills, the way her eyes moved when a hawk crossed overhead. She was not the woman who had been sitting against that post. Or rather, she was, but something else was also present now. Something that had simply been waiting beneath the exhaustion for something specific enough to call it back. The farm appeared first as a smell, dry hay and horse, the good animal smell of a working stable, and then, as a silhouette of fence posts and a low house and the dark rectangular shapes of 3 barn buildings set back from the road. She straightened in the saddle when she saw the horses in the paddock. He noticed that and said nothing. He showed her the property the way he showed everyone, walking the fence line, opening barn doors, naming the animals by name because he believed that helped. 3 working horses, 2 young mares he was training for sale, a black stallion named Kaio, who had been a problem since the day he arrived, kicking, refusing to be handled, destructive in his stall in ways that had cost Eitan 2 fence panels and a good bridle. "I've thought about selling him a dozen times," Eitan said, standing outside Kaio's stall. The horse was back in the corner, head low, ears pinned. Dunya stood at the stall door for a long time without moving. She didn't reach for the latch. She didn't make sounds. She just looked, and Kaio's ears moved, and she looked some more. "Don't sell him," she said. That was all she said about that. Inside the house, he set a pan on the stove and made a meal he would not have called remarkable. Salt pork, beans, cornbread from yesterday. But it was hot, and there was enough of it, and he put a full plate in front of her without ceremony. She ate slowly at first, then the way she had drunk from the canteen. Halfway through, she reached for a dish at the center of the table, and her elbow caught her own plate. It hit the floor and broke in 2 clean pieces, and the food scattered across the boards, and she was on her feet before the sound finished, her hands already raised, her breath coming fast and shallow, a stream of apologies pouring out of her mouth in the rushed, automatic cadence of someone who has learned to get ahead of the punishment. Eitan bent down. He picked up the 2 pieces of plate. He scraped the food off the floor with the edge of a spoon, put it in the bucket under the sink, and took a new plate from the shelf, and served her more beans, and put it on the table in front of her empty spot. Then he sat back down and picked up his fork. He said nothing at all. She stood for several more seconds, hands still slightly raised. Then the apologies tapered off. She sat down slowly. She looked at the plate. She looked at him. He was cutting his cornbread. She picked up her fork. He heard her exhale, just once, very quietly. Nobody yelled, he thought she was probably thinking. Nobody yelled, and nothing happened. He understood that this was not a small thing for her. He understood that whatever had been done to her had been done systematically and for a very long time. The way you have to work at breaking something that starts out strong. He understood these things quietly, from the inside of his own history, and he did not say any of it aloud, because that would have made it about him. She was in the stable before dawn. He found her there when he came out at 5:30, walking the central corridor slowly, pausing at each stall, not touching, not interfering, just looking with those sharp, certain eyes he had seen once at the market, and not again until now. "The grey mare's left hind shoe is set too tight," she said when she heard him come in. "She'll go lame in another week if it stays, and someone's been overfeeding the young chestnut. His grain needs to be cut by 1/3. She said it the way she might say the sun came up, not as an opinion, not as an offer, just as a fact about the world that needed to be acknowledged. He found a farrier that afternoon. He adjusted the chestnut's rations himself. Both horses responded within days. She stayed, not because he had offered anything formal, not because there was a contract or a wage discussed. She stayed the way water finds low ground, not by decision exactly, but by the logic of where she fit. She woke before him every morning and was already in the stable when he arrived, and the horses were calmer and the problems were fewer, and there was something in the air of the Hale Ranch that had not been there before she came, something that felt almost like the place was remembering what it was supposed to be. On the 4th evening, he came into the barn to find her sitting cross-legged outside Kaio's stall. The black stallion was standing at the front of the stall, his head low, his ears soft, his nose almost touching the bars between them. Not touching, but almost. Eitan leaned in the doorway and watched for a while, and then went back to the house. He thought about Clara, He thought about the way she used to stand in the doorway of the kitchen in the early morning, before the day started, the specific kind of quiet that existed in a house when more than one person was alive inside it. He hadn't thought about that in a long time. He asked her about the past on a Saturday evening, 3 weeks after she'd arrived. They were sitting on the porch in the hour after supper when the light went copper and the distant hills turned dark. He had a cup of coffee cooling in his hand. She had her knees pulled up and her hair loose, which he had noticed she only allowed when she felt safe, and which told him more than anything she said. "Where did you learn all of it?" he asked. "The horses." Her hands, resting on her knees, went still. "My father," she said after a moment. "He was a horse breeder, Orc, from the western province." A pause. "My mother was human. She died when I was 9. He waited. "I grew up in the stables, more than the house." The corner of her mouth moved, not quite a smile, but something adjacent to one. "My father used to say a horse will tell you everything you need to know about a man, because horses don't lie." She looked out at the darkening hills. "He died when I was 19, left me the horses and nothing else because there was nothing else to leave." She was quiet for a while. "I found work at a place called the Thorn Stables. The owner was a man named Varek." The name settled into the warm evening air and seemed to cool it slightly. She did not look at him when she said it. She looked at the hills. "He was building something, a breeding program, not just selling horses, building a reputation, the kind that takes years and costs a great deal." She paused. He knew very little about horses himself. What he knew was money and men and how to make people feel that they were being honored by his attention. "He hired you. He hired me to shovel stalls." She said it without bitterness, which somehow made it worse. "I'd been there 3 weeks when I told him the mare he'd just paid a great sum for was carrying a foal that wouldn't survive to term. I could see it in the way she moved. He didn't believe me. The foal died 3 months later. After that, he started asking questions." "After that," she confirmed. The story came out slowly, the way old wounds drain, not flooding, but with the particular steady pressure of something that has been closed for too long. She told him how she had chosen the bloodlines, how she had identified which young animals had the qualities worth developing and which were beautiful but hollow, how she had quietly, over 5 years, built the actual foundation of what Varek presented to the world as his genius. She told him this without anger in her voice, which he found more troubling than anger would have been. The anger had been there once. He could hear the shape of the place it used to occupy. "I never asked for credit," she said. "At first, I just wanted to work with the horses." She looked at her hands, the calluses, the small scar near her left collarbone, a reminder of the day a panicked stallion had caught her with a split board when she was 23, the day her father's oldest friend had said, "You should have died and you didn't," which means the horses still need you. She had never forgotten that. But after a few years, I thought perhaps I had earned the right to be known. Not famous, just known. She asked Varek for a formal title, a share of the earnings from the animals she had developed, her name on the sale documents. "He laughed," she said, "not cruelly. That was the worst part. He laughed like I had said something that didn't quite make sense, like the idea that I would want recognition for my own work was an endearing kind of confusion." After that, things began to disappear. Records went missing, ledgers were altered. Visiting buyers who had spoken directly with her about bloodlines and training techniques were told she was a general stable hand. Twice, she later learned, Varek had quietly suggested to potential clients that she had been responsible for errors that had been his own. "He didn't fire me," she said. "He didn't have to. He just made the walls closer every month until there was no air left." She paused for a long moment. "Before I left," she said, "I took everything I had written down, 7 years of records, Bloodlines, crossbreedings, training notes, every animal I had ever worked with. I wrapped them in oilcloth and hid them in the cellar of an abandoned property I used to use as a training ground, 2 hours east along the valley road. She looked at her hands again. I always believed he'd found them eventually, so I never went back. Eitan was quiet for a moment. He didn't find them, he said. You know that, don't you? She turned to look at him for the first time in a long while. In the lamplight from the open door behind them, her eyes were gold, not green, and very clear. I know, she said softly. She looked back at the stars, and for a long moment, neither of them said anything, and the silence between them was the comfortable kind, the kind that doesn't need to be filled, that exists between people who have stopped pretending that everything is simpler than it is. 5 days before Bran appeared on the road, she and Eitan had gone to find the notebooks. They had ridden 2 hours east along the valley road at first light, the country still cool and grey around them, neither of them speaking much. She had given him the directions the night before, and he had simply said, "We'll leave at dawn," and that had been the end of the discussion. The abandoned property was exactly as she had left it in her memory, perhaps smaller, the way places from the past tend to shrink when you return to them as a different person. The roof of the main building had partially collapsed. The training paddock fence had fallen in 3 sections. The cellar door was swollen with seasons of rain and took both of them to pull open. Inside, the oilcloth bundle was exactly where she had left it, pressed into a gap behind the lowest shelf, wrapped tight, tied with cord that had darkened but held. She unwrapped it slowly. Her hands shook and she let them. The notebooks were intact, the writing her own, the dates her own, 7 years of work pressed between oil-darkened covers. She held them against her chest in that cellar and breathed very carefully, and she did not cry because she had spent so many years training herself not to. But something in her throat had ached for a long time on the ride home. Now, Bran was coming up the road, and she knew exactly what his visit meant. She had seen him twice before, both times standing behind Varric at the kind of distance that meant, "This is the man who does the things I don't want to be seen doing." She recognized the way he sat his horse, the expressionless face of someone who had practiced controlling whatever he actually thought for so long that only the practice remained. Eitan came out of the barn when he heard the horse on the road. Bran dismounted without being invited to. He introduced himself by his first name and said he represented certain business interests in the region. He was polite in the particular way of someone who doesn't need to be rude because they believe the conversation is already decided. He offered Eitan a sum of money. He said it as though the number would close the matter before anything else needed to be said. The number was large enough that Eitan would not have to worry about the water fitting or the grain prices or the new fence sections for a long while. In exchange, Dunya would leave the Hale Ranch and relocate wherever she chose, as long as it was far and as long as it was quiet. And she would not speak to anyone about the Thorn stables or Varric or anything that had occurred during the years she worked there. Bran said all of this pleasantly, looking at Eitan, not at her. Dunya stood at the paddock fence with Kaio's lead rope in her hand and felt the old cold spread through her chest. She knew this feeling. It was the feeling of walls getting closer. It was the feeling of air being rationed. For a moment, just a moment, she thought about saying yes, about disappearing again, about the simplicity of not fighting something so large and so patient in its cruelty. Then she thought about the notebooks. She thought about 7 years of work in her own handwriting. "No," she said. Bran looked at her for the first time. His eyes recalculated. "Miss, no," she said again. "Quiet, certain." She looked at Eitan. He was already looking at her. His face was still and unreadable in the way she had come to understand meant he was not uncertain, only choosing. He looked at Bran. "I think you have your answer," he said. Bran left without urgency, which was somehow more alarming than if he'd threatened them. Men who left calmly were men who had other arrangements already made. The consequences arrived within the week. A buyer who had made a verbal agreement on 2 of Iton's mares withdrew without explanation. A feed supplier who had dealt with the Hale Ranch for 9 years sent a message saying he was no longer able to make the route. The farrier who had fixed the grey mare's shoe was suddenly unavailable for future appointments. Each thing individually was explainable. Together they were a sentence written in a language Dunya had read before. One morning, she found the door of the main hay storage open and a large section of winter feed ruined by water. The lock had not been forced. It had been opened with a key or something very like one. 3 nights after that, Kaio was missing from his stall. They found him at dawn, standing loose in the scrub oak a mile north of the property line, unhurt, unbothered, cropping dry grass. Someone had opened his stall door and the paddock gate and left them open. No damage, no injury. Just a clear demonstration of access and capability and patience. Eitan stood looking at the open gate for a long time. "You could ask me to leave," Dunya said. She said it evenly, without accusation. "I could do a lot of things," he said, and went to find Kaio's lead rope. It was Corvin who came to them first. He arrived at the Hale Ranch on a grey morning, riding a horse that was too old for long trips, looking like a man who had made a decision he was not yet sure he could sustain. He was 63, with white hair and a long beard, and he had the particular quality of a person who has carried a specific guilt for so long that it has become part of his posture. He had been a handler at the Thorns stables for 11 years. He said he had seen everything Dunya described. He had not spoken before because Varek paid well, and the region was not a forgiving place for people who lost Varek's favor, and he had a daughter and 2 grandchildren and not much else. "I know that's not enough reason," he said. "I know that." Dunya looked at him for a long time. "Sit down," she said. "Tell me what you remember." Iton had spent 2 weeks riding out from the farm in different directions, visiting towns along the trade road, talking quietly to people who had crossed paths with Varek's operation over the years. He was careful about how he asked. He was careful about who he asked. He had grown up in this country and understood its rhythms, understood that trust moved slowly here, and that patience was the only currency that didn't lose value. He found Tarek in the town of Milford, working at his smithy, a broad-backed man with white hair and a direct manner who remembered a half-orc woman who had come to him 6 years ago with a specific commission, a set of specialized stable tools with unusual specifications that a general blacksmith wouldn't have been asked for. He had kept the original drawings. He had not known why. He had simply kept them. He gave them to Iton without being asked twice. Marek was harder. He was a horse breeder himself, a competitor of Varek's in a low and cautious way, intelligent enough to know that everything he said could be used against him somehow. He met Iton at a roadside tavern and drank 1 glass of something and said almost nothing for 20 minutes. Then he said, "I always knew the horses didn't come from him. Nobody who knows horses like those were known could talk about them the way he talked about them. He talked about them like a man describes a painting he owns. He didn't say Dunya's name, but the word pointed clearly. She talked about them like they were family she was responsible for." He paused. "If something is happening," he said carefully, "I would consider appearing somewhere public to say what I just told you. If the circumstances were such that silence would cost me more than speaking." Itan nodded and paid for both drinks and rode home. He had also written a letter 3 weeks earlier to a man named Harlan, the most respected independent buyer in the region, a man who had purchased horses from the Thorns stables on 5 separate occasions, who had a memory for quality and a reputation for honesty that made him untouchable to the kind of social pressure Varek usually deployed. The letter had been careful and specific. He had not yet received a reply, and the silence sat in the back of his mind like an unturned stone. Dunya was on the porch when he arrived back, late and tired, with Kaio at the paddock fence behind her, watching him come up the road. The stallion had stopped being a problem entirely now. He allowed himself to be handled, exercised, groomed. He still preferred Dunya to anyone else, which Eitan thought was his best quality and very reasonable. Eitan told her about Corvin, about Tarek, about Marek. She listened with her hands still on her knees and her face doing the careful thing it did when she was feeling something large and didn't want to show it yet. "There's an event," Eitan said. "The Ashmore Fair, 6 weeks out. Every major breeder and buyer in the region comes through. Varek will be there." She was quiet. "It would be the right place," he said, "the right audience." She stood and walked to the paddock fence and put her hand flat on Kaio's nose, and he breathed against her palm, and she stood like that for a long time in the evening dark. "If I go," she said finally, "and it doesn't work—" "It might not work," he said. He was not going to lie to her. He had decided that early on, that she had been lied to by omission so many times that honesty, even uncomfortable honesty, was the only form of respect worth offering. She was quiet for a long time. Then, "I almost left last week after Kaio. I almost packed what I had and went before it could get worse." "I know." She looked at him. The moon was rising over the eastern ridge, and in the pale light her eyes were the color of old copper. "Why didn't you ask me to?" He thought about Clara, about the farm in the long years after, about the specific weight of a life that goes on but doesn't quite go forward. "Because you were right about the grey mare," he said. "You were right about Kaio. You were right about all of it. And someone who's right about all of it deserves to have someone stand next to them when they say so." She looked at him for a moment longer. Then she turned back to Kaio and rubbed the spot between his ears that he liked, and he pressed his head into her hand. "6 weeks," she said. The Ashmore Fair stretched across the valley floor like a small city. 3 days of trading and judging, and the particular social intensity of people whose livelihoods and reputations were wound together in ways they spent the rest of the year pretending they weren't. Eitan had been to Ashmore 4 times in his life. He knew the way the crowds formed, the serious buyers near the main judging ring, the gossip along the food stalls, the horse handlers grouped by affiliation and loyalty in patterns that hadn't changed in 30 years. He also knew where Varek would be, at the center of things, as always, comfortable in the current he had spent decades cultivating. They arrived the morning of the second day. Dunya wore her good shirt. Eitan had not known she had a good shirt until 2 days before the fair, when she had appeared in the kitchen in a dark green garment with small buttons at the collar. Her black hair braided back, her posture the naturally elegant thing it always was when she stopped hunching against the expectation of harm. She had looked at him, and he had looked at her, and neither of them said anything about it, but something shifted slightly in the quality of the air between them, and remained shifted for the rest of the morning. They brought the notebooks. They brought Corvin, who had spent 3 weeks writing a formal account of everything he'd witnessed. They brought the tool drawings from Tarek, original in Dunya's hand, and they had a letter from Marek, careful, precise, and signed, describing what he knew and had observed over the years. 4 days before the fair, a reply had finally arrived from Harlan. It said only, "I'll be at Ashmore. I remember the woman with the emerald skin who told me about the dam's temperament and was right about everything." Eitan had read it twice and folded it and put it in his coat pocket and not mentioned it to Dunya yet, because he wanted to see what happened first. The crowd near the main ring was thick with mourning. Varek was exactly where Eitan had expected him, holding court near the premium stall section, silver-haired, well-dressed, performing the particular graciousness of a man who believed his own reputation was simply the accurate measurement of a reality he had created. He saw Dunya the moment she came through the crowd. His expression did not change. His eyes did. She walked to the center of the main thoroughfare, and Eitan walked beside her, and the crowd shifted and made space the way crowds do when something is about to happen that most of them don't yet understand. As she took her place, Dunya noticed a man near the edge of the crowd she hadn't expected, Bran standing still, watching. He wore no expression. He made no move. She held his gaze for one moment and then turned away from him, because what was about to happen did not require his permission or his absence. She spoke clearly. She did not shout. She did not accuse. She presented. She named every horse she had selected, bred, or trained that now bore Varek's mark. She showed the notebooks, pages read aloud, dates given, details precise enough that anyone who knew horses recognized the depth immediately. Corvin stepped forward and confirmed line by line what he had witnessed. Tarek's drawings were passed through the crowd. Marek's letter was read. Varek began speaking before she finished the second notebook. His voice was assured and measured and carried the practiced cadence of a man who had talked his way out of difficult rooms before. He was generous in his dismissal. He was gracious in his corrections. He called her troubled. He called her confused. He used the word, unfortunately, 3 times. Then Harlan stepped forward from the crowd. He was 67 years old and had bought horses in this valley for 40 years and was owed favors by more people in that crowd than Varek could count. He stood beside Dunya and said, simply, that he remembered her, that she had advised him on a purchase 10 years ago and had been correct about every detail, that the purchase had been among the best of his career, and that he had at the time asked Varek who the half-orc woman was, and Varek had told him she was a stable hand who had happened to be nearby. "She's not a stable hand," Harlan said. "She never was." The crowd was very quiet. Varek's next sentence was less assured than the last, and the one after that less still. He was a man whose power was made of other people's willingness to believe the version he offered, and the crowd was no longer quite as willing as it had been 3 minutes ago. More voices came forward, small ones. People Eaton hadn't organized, buyers who recognized her name from old transaction records, a trainer who remembered a consultation years ago, 2 young stable hands from a neighboring property who had once worked under her direction and hadn't known until this moment that what they'd experienced was rare. Each voice was small. Together they made something the size and shape of a record. Among the crowd, Dunya noticed the emblem on the jacket of a man she did not recognize, a careful gold thread insignia she knew from her father's old books, the mark of the Grunmar Breeders' Association. He was watching everything with the focused attention of someone who was not there by accident. Varek left the fairground in the late afternoon, while the second judging round was still going on. He left quietly, which was the only dignified exit available to him. Bran left with him, 2 steps behind, as he always had been. Nobody stopped them. Nobody made a scene. They simply were no longer at the center of things, and the center of things continued without them. Dunya stood in the middle of the Ashmore thoroughfare as the afternoon light went long and gold, and Eitan stood 2 feet to her right, and Corvin and Harlan and Marek and a dozen other people whose names she was still learning stood around her in the loose, organic formation of people who have chosen a side, and she looked at all of it for a long time. Her hands were shaking, not from fear. 3 days after Ashmore, 2 representatives of the Grunmar Breeders' Association arrived at the Hale Ranch. They were the same men she had seen at the fair. She recognized the gold thread emblem immediately. They were polite and well-dressed, and clearly had been sent by people who did not come themselves, which meant the offer was serious. They laid it out plainly, a formal position as a breeding consultant to the association, the largest orc-led breeding organization in the region, access to their stock, her name on their records. A salary that would have seemed impossible to her 2 months ago, when she had been sitting in the dust of a market lane in Stoneford with a chain on her wrists and a sign that said she was worth nothing. She listened to them. She asked 2 questions about the structure of the position. They answered well. She told them she needed a few days. They said of course, and left. And she stood on the porch in the early afternoon and watched their horses go down the road until the dust settled back into stillness. She stayed on the porch for a long time after that. Eitan came out eventually. He did not ask anything. He stood beside her and looked at the road and said nothing, which she had come to understand was one of the better things about him. The specific quality of his silences, the way they didn't press or wait or lean. "It's a good offer," she said. "It is," he agreed. She looked at the paddock. Kaio was in the far corner of the pasture, moving slowly through the dry grass, his black coat catching the afternoon light in a way that made him look almost gentle. Almost. "I need to go to Stoneford," she said. He didn't ask why. He went and saddled the horses. The market was quieter on a weekday. The big stalls were closed, and only the permanent vendors were working, the ones who built their life around the market rather than arriving for it. She navigated through the familiar smells, hay and iron and old wood, and the sharp sweetness of dried fruit, until she reached the smaller lane behind the livestock pens. The post was still there. Of course it was. It was a fence post. It did not know what had happened near it. She stood in front of it for a while. The chain was gone. Someone had taken it, probably for scrap, which seemed right. The post was weathered and slightly tilted from the dry earth around it. There was nothing remarkable about it at all. She thought about the woman who had sat against it. She could remember the feeling from the inside, the specific weight of having decided, without quite deciding, that it was finished, that the next thing that happened would happen to someone who was no longer really there, that the distance between yourself and your own life was finally complete. She thought about water set on the ground without conditions, about a plate replaced without comment, about a chain cut without a word. She exhaled slowly through her nose and looked at the post for a final moment, and then turned away. Eitan was waiting at the entrance to the lane. He had the horse's reins in one hand and was looking at nothing in particular, in the way he looked at things when he was thinking something he hadn't decided whether to say. She walked up to him. She stopped close enough that she could have touched him if she'd reached out, and she didn't. But the space between them had a different quality now than it had had 3 weeks ago. Warmer, more settled, like wood that has been near a fire long enough to hold the heat on its own. "I'm going to write to the association tomorrow," she said. He looked at her. "And tell them yes," she said, "but that I'll need to maintain a working arrangement with the Hale Ranch as a condition." He was quiet for a moment. "I don't know if they'll agree to that," he said, not arguing, just honest. "Then they'll tell me no," she said, "and I'll tell them I appreciate the offer." She took her horse's reins from his hand and swung up into the saddle. He mounted beside her, and they turned toward the east road, and the afternoon light was coming in long and amber across the whole wide country, and the road ran straight through it all the way to the farm. They rode without hurrying. There was no urgency anymore. The urgency had been for a different part of the story. The road home was the same 12 miles it had always been, dry and red and particular in the way of this land, and the scrub oak threw long shadows across it in the low sun, and Kaio would be waiting in the pasture, and the grey mare's feet were right now, and the chestnut ate the correct amount, small, ordinary things, the kind worth coming home to. Dunya rode with her back straight and her hair loose in the warm evening wind, and her eyes on the horizon, and she did not look back at the town. She did not need to. Some doors close completely when you walk away from them, and there is no sound when they do, just the quiet of a life that has finally found its own direction, and the road ahead, and the particular warmth of not being alone in the riding of it. The Hale Ranch appeared on the hill as the last light went. She rode through the gate and did not slow. She was home. Did you enjoy the story? Subscribe to the channel to watch more stories like this one. Leave a like, it helps the channel a lot. And drop a comment down below. I always read them and use your feedback to make our content better. Thanks so much. Orc-Bound Legacy.